My name is Rashida Phillips. I am a Philadelphia-based artist, attorney, advocate, writer, many other things. And I work primarily as part of a collective called Black Quantum Futurism as an artist. We make interdisciplinary art. A lot of it is community-based and community-engaged art, but also work across disciplines, do work in music and sound, as well as writing, as well as visual art, and as well as do a lot of installation-based work. And then we also do performance-based work, and then work that falls at the intersections of all of those things. As a collective, Black Quantum Futurism is really thinking about time and thinking about the temporal dimension of the future as a place that has actively denied Black people and Black communities access for a number of different reasons related to history and related to white supremacy and capitalism. And so a lot of our work is about sort of thinking about Afrofuturism and really using that as a basis for our work, but departing from there and really thinking about what that temporal domain of the future means when it's accessed through by a Black person or by a Black body, or using Black modes of space and time, or how our ancestors have thought about space and time in ways that are more beneficial and more in line with us surviving and thriving and making it into the future. And also understanding through Black Quantum Futurism, thinking about, taking this privilege away from this domain of the future and saying that the past is equally important, the now is equally important, and they're not necessarily situated in front of us in this sort of linear trajectory. And so we really question that, and through our work question that. Because I'm also a housing attorney and I work with low income communities in Philadelphia who are at risk of losing their housing or have already lost their housing or at risk of being displaced or pushed out of their communities. Afrofuturism and the work that we've developed through Black Quantum Futurism felt like natural tie-ins to this kind of work of thinking about the futures of communities and how we support communities around building their futures or accessing their futures, and not having those futures be predetermined by governments or by housing authorities or by things that are outside of their control. Because when these entities control or build the future, right, those folks don't get a say in that future. They don't get access to that future in the same ways. They get pushed out of their futures, and then their pasts get erased, their histories get erased, their culture gets erased, their narratives get taken from them, and they get painted as people who don't deserve community, don't deserve land, don't deserve space, don't deserve time, or don't deserve the future unless they conform themselves to whatever it is that the government thinks they should be, whether it's middle class people or living in suburbs or whatever type of housing the government deems as, fitting in line with the suburban two-child white picket fence narrative and future. These sort of white picket fence futurisms that they have. So really our work is about that and undoing that, and creating and recovering and connecting technologies that have already been developed or that we develop ourselves as Black folks, as Black women, as Black people, as queer Black people, as a Black parent, what we've done in connection to our communities. And so our artwork really, our art comes out of that. And it's also really intentionally erasing the lines between like art and not art, and art and other technologies or other modes of survival and culture making and time making and space making with community members. So a lot of the works that are in the exhibition are about that. It's about, for example, we have pieces that are from our Community Futures Lab project uh, that comes out of another project called Community Futurisms, Time and Memory in North Philly, which really thinks about North Philly as a space and site of Black futurist liberation and Black temporal liberation, and experiments in Black spatial agency. And so part of what we did in that space was to, we had a year-long community space called Community Futures Lab, that was housed in a community in North Philly undergoing active displacement due to eminent domain that had been done, where 1,300 properties were sort of taken through that process, and people were sort of displaced through that process. And so holding a space where people could come and provide their own narratives, their own visions of the future, recover their own memories about the beautiful things that were a part of that community, not just the sort of narratives of why the government was coming in and sort of having to do this eminent domain and redevelopment of this entire neighborhood, which came complete with erasures of cultural memory and cultural artifacts. And so recovering those, talking with neighbors, recording oral futures interviews with them. And through that project, we uncovered and recovered other sort of projects historically through North Philly. And so some of the pieces there in the show are based on this project called Black Space Agency, which is a literal Black space agency that was built in the middle of North Philly in 1968 during the space race, and as well as the fight for civil rights and housing and Black liberation. And so we got a bunch of old Jet magazines, Ebony magazines, archives of this thing that had existed that no one talks about, no one, that I know of has heard about, like a literal Black aerospace agency being built in North Philly, and creating work around and about that. So that's some of the pieces that are part of that show. Yeah, I was babbling down some other path. So yeah, so the collages, so for example, the collages that are in the show, some of them are from that Black Space Agency project, which layers sort of these archival papers, archival documents, images of Black liberation and Black involvement in the space race and in the civil rights movement and in the housing rights movement in 1968 and in North Philadelphia in particular. And so getting old newspapers, old Jet and Ebony magazines from that time period, and collaging and layering those images, and again, like sort of troubling this notion of linear time, and that the same conditions that existed in 1968 are still present, right? We have not been cut off from that past. It is still very present, and so like just really troubling that. And so some of the other pieces and works that are in there are clocks from our series called Dismantling the Master's Clock, Clockwork Universe. And so these are a series of clocks that we have been developing since we started creating work. And they are based really on our studies around the history of time, the history of time and its material culture around clocks and timepieces, and sort of the ways in which those things were used to regulate labor, slave labor, the labor of enslaved and captivated Africans on the plantations. Just again, the sort of history of the clock and its use in colonialism and being able to go out and colonize and imperialism, like literally the sort of clock being used to mediate Captain Cook, for example, making it to Australia, having an successful voyage to Australia that led to, sort of the colonization and genocide of the indigenous people there, right? So really looking at clocks as these objects that aren't questioned. They're like maps in that, when we look at a map, often we are thinking of a map as objective. When we look at a clock, we're thinking of it as objective and as really telling us what the time is, but it's not. It's just, right, it's an object that embodies one way of thinking about experiencing, viewing time that happens to be rooted in capitalism and colonialism and white supremacy. And so we take the clock and we question that, we break it down, we layer other times and people and images over it. And also in doing that, attempting to sort of liberate Blackness from white supremacist linear time, especially what our clocks are also calling back to is during, you know, sort of slavery, post-slavery, Jim Crow era, these images of the mammy or, you know, you know, these caricatures of Black people stuck inside of these clocks and these banks, like, you know, the nigger clock or the nigger bank, you know, these kinds of things. So really pushing back, undoing, uncovering, delving in to that kind of a history, and breaking it apart and dismantling this sort of clock time is the intention behind some of that work. When we think about de-gentrified futures as a collective, just some key words that we think about futures that are quantum. We think about futures that are non-binary. We think about futures that are full of paradoxes. We think about futures that are not necessarily resolved, futures that are not fatalistic and not set. So futures that are poly and multiple and polyrhythmic, futures that are abundant and feminine and nonlinear and whatever direction we want them to be. Futures that are communal, futures where I don't think of the future as utopia, and we're not moving towards that. We're moving towards a place where there is multiplicity and paradox and where multiple things can be true at once without necessarily conflict that's going to disrupt the universe and split it apart, as they like to, you know, tell you in time travel and in the grandfather paradox. Right, so futures that are grandmother paradoxes, you know, just these kinds of futures. That's what we see as the future, and we do an exercise through our work called a quantum event map, where we have folks come together to think about those elements that around what does the future smell like, what does it taste like, what does the past taste like, what other things are present. Where time is not just the only thing that guides the event or the experience, where time is not supreme. It's just a part of the experience like anything else. The smells and the sounds and the tactile things are just as important as the time of day it is or the month it is. Like, that's not even important. So that's the future I see. One, not necessarily timeless. I don't think of time itself as the enemy. I think of the way that time is constructed by white people and white supremacy as the enemy. But I think when we shift from time to temporality, and we shift from the sort of scientific construction of time to the experience of time, temporality, people coming together, your own subjective experience of how you move through the world, however you measure that, I see a world where all of those things are valid, and it's not just the clock is the supreme measurement of what time is and what the day is and what the future.